The day I found out my neighbors were planning to physically move my house, I honestly thought somebody had mixed me up with another property owner. Then I saw the steel beams. Then I saw the hydraulic equipment. And then a contractor looked me straight in the eye and calmly told me they were preparing to rotate my cabin to improve somebody else's view. My name is Caleb Foster, and for almost 13 years I lived on a mountainside outside a small Colorado community called Pine Hollow. It wasn't the kind of place that showed up in travel magazines. No luxury spas, no celebrity retreats, just winding roads, pine forests, and enough quiet to hear the wind move through the trees before a storm rolled in. That quiet was exactly why I stayed. I bought the property in my late 30s after my divorce. At the time, I wasn't looking for a fresh start. I was looking for a place where nobody expected anything from me. The land wasn't impressive to most people. 8 acres of steep hillside covered in rock, timber, and stubborn patches of brush that seemed determined to survive every winter. Most contractors told me building there would be a nightmare. They weren't wrong. The only workable section was a narrow shelf carved into the slope about halfway up the mountain. My father and I spent nearly a year preparing that site. We drilled into bedrock, reinforced retaining walls, hauled materials up roads that barely deserved to be called roads, and somehow managed to build a cabin that looked like it had grown directly out of the mountain. My father passed away 2 years later. Ever since then, every corner of that cabin carried memories. The porch railing we rebuilt twice because we measured wrong. The stone fireplace he insisted on making larger than necessary. The workshop where we'd spend entire weekends arguing about absolutely nothing important. People see lumber and concrete. I saw history. For years, life stayed simple. I traveled occasionally for engineering consulting jobs, spent most weekends maintaining trails on my property, and enjoyed the kind of routine that gets more valuable as you get older. Then the property next door sold. At first, I barely noticed. Mountain properties changed owners all the time. Most people bought them because they wanted privacy. Then the Whitmore family arrived. Travis and Elena Whitmore. The first thing I noticed wasn't them. It was the convoy. 3 luxury SUVs, 2 trailers, survey crews, architects, and enough equipment to make it look like they were preparing to launch a space program. Within days, drones were flying overhead. Survey stakes appeared everywhere. Contractors came and went nonstop. And every conversation somehow turned into Travis describing what he called their vision. Not a home, never a home, a vision. One afternoon, I ran into him near the property line while repairing a section of fencing. He stood looking across the valley with the expression of a man admiring something he already believed belonged to him. "You know what this place needs?" he asked. I hadn't asked, but I knew he was going to tell me anyway. What? A world-class mountain lodge. I looked around. Trees, rocks, mountains. Exactly what I liked about it. "Seems fine the way it is," I said. He laughed. Not because the comment was funny, because he thought I was joking. "We're thinking bigger than that." Over the following months, I learned Travis had spent years developing luxury properties in resort towns. Everywhere he went, things got larger, more expensive, and more complicated. His wife Elena handled investor relations. Travis handled the dreaming. And apparently he dreamed very, very big. At first our interactions stayed friendly. Then little things started happening. A drone hovering over my roofline. Survey markers appearing suspiciously close to my property. Contractors wandering across boundaries they shouldn't have crossed. Nothing dramatic, just enough to make me uncomfortable. One morning, I found a drone hovering outside my kitchen window while I was making coffee. Not near the window, outside the window. I walked outside and followed it back toward the Whitmore property. Sure enough, Travis stood there holding the controller. "Mind keeping that thing on your side?" I asked. He lowered the drone, just gathering topographical data. From my kitchen, he smiled. That smile, the kind that says he already decided your concerns don't matter. No harm intended. Maybe this should have been my warning sign. Maybe this should have been the moment I realized some people stop recognizing boundaries once they've spent enough years getting everything they want. But life moved on. A few weeks later, I left for a 5-day consulting assignment in Denver. Nothing unusual. I packed a bag, locked the cabin, and figured I'd be back before the weekend. I had absolutely no idea that while I was gone, my neighbors would come up with a plan so unbelievably arrogant that even now, Years later, people still ask me if the story is actually true. Because when I finally returned home that Friday afternoon and turned on my access road, the first thing I saw wasn't my cabin. It was a construction site. And sitting beside my house was enough steel and hydraulic equipment to move a building. That's when my stomach dropped. Because deep down, before anybody said a word, I already knew none of that equipment was there by accident. I pulled my truck to a stop and just sat there for a second, staring through the windshield. Steel support beams, hydraulic jacks, stacks of lumber, temporary fencing, workers moving around with clipboards. The whole scene looked less like a construction project and more like somebody was preparing to launch my cabin into orbit. At first, I honestly thought there had been some kind of emergency while I was gone. Maybe a landslide risk, maybe foundation damage, maybe county inspectors had discovered something serious. That explanation lasted about 30 seconds. Then I got out of the truck and started walking toward the nearest supervisor. He looked up from his paperwork. "Can I help you?" "Yeah," I said. "You can tell me why all this equipment is sitting next to my house." He glanced at the cabin, then back at me. "The relocation project." I frowned. "The what?" "The structure relocation project." For a moment, I genuinely thought we'd skipped part of the conversation. "What structure?" He pointed directly at my cabin. My cabin. The one I'd spent 13 years living in. The one my father helped build. The one sitting exactly where it had always sat. That structure. I stared at him. He stared back. Neither of us said anything for a few seconds. Finally, he cleared his throat. "We're scheduled to rotate the building approximately 11 degrees clockwise." I actually laughed. Not because it was funny, because my brain rejected the sentence. "You what? 11 degrees. Why?" The answer still amazes me. To improve the western sight line for the neighboring development. Western sight line. Not my home. Not private property. Not somebody's life. A sight line. A visual inconvenience. I looked around at the workers. Nobody seemed confused. Nobody looked concerned. To them, this was just another job, which somehow made it worse. Because it meant somebody had spent months planning this. Drawing blueprints. Holding meetings. Approving budgets. And apparently nobody along the way had stopped to ask one very simple question. What if the homeowner says no? I walked away before my temper got the better of me and immediately called Travis. He answered on the second ring. "Caleb." The cheerful tone hit me like gasoline on a fire. "Why are there contractors preparing to move my house?" There was a pause. Not a surprised pause. A disappointed pause. Like he had hoped somebody else would handle this conversation. "Oh," he said. "You got back earlier than expected." Earlier than expected. Not hello. Not sorry. Now let's explain. Earlier than expected. Travis. Another sigh. Then he launched into what sounded like a presentation he'd rehearsed. The lodge design evolved during final development. What does that mean? It means your cabin currently interferes with several premium viewing corridors. I stood there in my driveway, trying to process what I was hearing. My cabin interferes with your view? Only partially. Only partially. Like that somehow made it reasonable. He continued. "We hired structural consultants. The rotation is minimal. 11 degrees. Practically unnoticeable." I felt my jaw tighten. "You're talking about my house. We're talking about optimization." That word. Optimization. Somewhere along the line, Travis had convinced himself he wasn't dealing with people anymore. Everything had become assets. Layouts. Numbers. Obstacles. Optimization. I finally interrupted him. "Did I give you permission?" Silence. Then he changed directions. "Look, Caleb, we're investing millions into this project. It'll increase tourism, raise property values, create jobs. Did I give you permission?" Another pause. "No." "Then stay the hell away from my property." I hung up. The funny thing about anger is that eventually it settles into clarity. The first 10 minutes I was furious. The next 10 minutes I became organized. I photographed everything. Every vehicle. Every survey marker. Every piece of equipment. Every footprint crossing onto my land. Then I drove straight into town. There was only one person I trusted for situations like this. Laura Bennett. I've known Laura almost a decade. She's the kind of attorney who never raises her voice because she doesn't need to. The louder everyone else gets, the calmer she becomes. When I spread the photographs across her conference table, she spent several minutes silently reviewing them. The longer she looked, the less happy she appeared. Finally, she removed her glasses. Tell me this is some kind of misunderstanding. I wish. We spent the rest of the afternoon digging through documents. Property surveys, county permits, easements, development plans, construction filings. Everything. By evening, her desk looked like a paper explosion, and she leaned back in her chair. Okay, that was never a good sign. Okay, what? Okay, I figured out how insane this is. She started counting on her fingers. Trespassing, 1 finger. Unauthorized site access, 2nd finger. Potential property interference. 3rd, civil liability. 4th, potential criminal exposure depending on intent. 5th, and she looked up. And that's just what I found before dinner. For the first time all day, I smiled. So, they're in trouble? Laura shook her head. No, she pointed toward the photographs. They're about to become trouble. The next morning, cease and desist. Notices went out to everyone involved. Travis, Elena, the development company, the engineering consultants, the relocation contractors, the project managers, anybody whose name appeared on the paperwork. Then we waited. The response arrived less than 24 hours later from a law firm in Los Angeles. A very expensive law firm. You could practically smell billable hours through the envelope. Laura and I sat together reading the letter. Halfway through, she started laughing. Not amused laughing. Disbelief laughing. The argument basically claimed the proposed relocation would benefit the community, improve aesthetics, enhance tourism, increase economic opportunity. Then came the sentence that nearly made me choke on my coffee. They suggested I participate cooperatively and contribute financially toward the relocation effort. I read it twice, then a 3rd time, just to make sure my eyes weren't malfunctioning. They wanted me to help pay for moving my own house against my will. Laura stared at the page. 23 years. What? 23 years practicing law. She tapped the letter. This may be the dumbest thing I've ever read. The following morning, she filed for emergency injunctive relief. Things started moving quickly after that. Apparently, judges don't appreciate unauthorized attempts to reposition somebody else's house. The hearing was scheduled only days later. When the morning finally arrived, I walked into the courthouse expecting a fight. What I found instead was something very different. Because sitting across the room was Travis Whitmore, wearing a custom-tailored suit and an expression that suggested he still believed money was going to solve this problem. Beside him sat Elena. Neither of them looked worried. They looked annoyed, like they'd been inconvenienced. Meanwhile, Laura arrived carrying enough evidence to sink a battleship. Photographs, surveys, drone footage, property records, construction documentation, witness statements. At one point, she stacked everything on counsel table, and one of the deputies actually raised an eyebrow. The hearing began, and within minutes, I realized something important. For the first time since this whole nightmare started, Travis wasn't controlling the conversation anymore. The judge was, and judges tend to ask very simple questions that arrogant people hate answering. Questions like who owns the property, questions like who gave permission, questions like who thought this was a good idea. And as the hearing moved forward, I could see something changing in Travis's face. For the first time since I'd met him, uncertainty was beginning to creep in, because reality was finally entering the room, and reality was about to become very expensive. The hearing lasted less than an hour. Honestly, after everything Laura had prepared, it probably could have ended in 15 minutes. Judge Raymond Keller spent most of the proceeding quietly reviewing photographs. He zoomed in on images showing the steel lifting system positioned beside my cabin. He examined survey stakes crossing property boundaries. He looked at equipment parked on my land. The courtroom stayed unusually quiet. Then he looked over his glasses at Travis's attorney. Let me make sure I understand this correctly. Nobody interrupted him. Your clients intended to physically reposition a privately owned residential structure. The attorney immediately launched into a polished speech about development interests, economic benefits, tourism opportunities, and community enhancement. Judge Keller held up one hand. The attorney stopped. It was amazing how quickly expensive speeches disappear when a judge gets tired of listening. The judge asked a single question. Did the homeowner authorize this? Silence. Not long silence. Just long enough. Then came the second question. Did your clients possess legal authority to modify or relocate this structure? More silence. The judge nodded slowly. The kind of nod that tells you he's already reached a conclusion. A few minutes later, he issued the order. All work stopped immediately. Every piece of equipment had to be removed. All unauthorized activity near my property had to cease. The site had to be restored. And perhaps most importantly, compliance had to occur within 14 days. Then came the part nobody expected. If the defendants failed to comply, I would be authorized to arrange removal myself and recover associated costs. I remember looking over at Laura. She didn't smile. She never smiled during hearings. But I could see it in her eyes. This had gone very, very badly for Travis. Outside the courthouse, I was halfway to my truck when I heard somebody call my name. I turned around. Travis. Of course. He walked toward me with that familiar confidence, although now it looked forced. You don't understand what you're doing. I almost laughed. Really, this project is bigger than you realize. I looked back toward the courthouse. I think the judge understood it pretty clearly. His jaw tightened. For a second, the friendly developer mask slipped. Underneath, it was something else. Entitlement. Pure entitlement. This isn't over. No, I said. It probably isn't. Then I got in my truck and drove home. The next 2 weeks felt strange. Every morning I expected to see crews dismantling equipment. Nothing happened. Day 1. Nothing. Day 3. Nothing. Day 7. Nothing. The steel structure remained exactly where it was. The hydraulic systems remained untouched. The temporary access routes remained open. It was as if Travis had convinced himself the court order was merely a suggestion. Laura wasn't surprised. She said something I'll never forget. People who spend years getting their way eventually stop believing consequences are real. Day 14 arrived. Still nothing. That evening Laura called. You ready for tomorrow? I looked out my cabin window toward the giant steel framework sitting beside my house. The sunset reflected off the metal. For a moment, it almost looked beautiful. Then I remembered why it existed. Absolutely. She laughed. Good. Because the removal contractors are already scheduled. I slept surprisingly well that night. Not because I wasn't angry anymore. Because I was. But because for the first time since this started, I knew exactly what was coming. The next morning reality arrived at sunrise. First came the hauling trucks, then the excavators, then the welding crews, then county deputies carrying copies of the court order. Laura showed up with a coffee in one hand and a folder in the other. Beautiful day for compliance, she said. I laughed harder than I had in weeks. Then the work began. Welders cut through steel supports. Excavators pulled ground anchors free. Workers dismantled framework section by section. Sparks filled the morning air. The giant relocation system slowly disappeared piece by piece. Hour after hour. Truck after truck. By lunchtime, the structure looked half its original size. By early afternoon, most of it was gone. And that's when 2 black SUVs came racing up the mountain road. I didn't even need to see who was inside. I already knew. The first vehicle barely stopped before Travis jumped out. Elena followed seconds later. Both looked furious. Not frustrated. Not disappointed. Furious. Travis stormed toward us. What the hell is happening? One of the deputies calmly pointed toward the court order. Travis ignored him completely. You destroyed our equipment. I reached into my jacket pocket and handed him a copy of the same order. No, I pointed toward the paperwork. You abandoned your equipment on my property after a judge ordered you to remove it. He looked at Laura. You seriously think this is legal? For the first time all day, Laura smiled. A small smile. The dangerous kind. Actually, she said, this is one of the most legal things I've ever been involved in. For a second, I thought Travis might explode. Instead, he stood there staring at the empty space where his grand plan had once stood. Weeks earlier, he'd looked at my home and seen an obstacle. Now he was staring at the consequences of treating somebody else's home like a problem that needed solving. By late afternoon, the final truck rolled away. The site was clear. No estile, no machinery, no relocation system, nothing. Just my cabin, exactly where it had always been, rooted into the mountainside, right where my father and I built it. You'd think that would be the end of the story. It wasn't. About 2 months later, Travis filed a lawsuit seeking $130,000 for project delays. When Laura called me with the news, I laughed so hard I nearly dropped my phone. Apparently, Travis believed I was responsible for losses caused by his own failure to follow a court order. The hearing didn't last long. Judge Keller listened patiently, asked a few questions, reviewed the timeline, then leaned back in his chair. I'll never forget his exact words. The plaintiff's financial losses appear to be the direct consequence of the plaintiff's own decisions. Case dismissed. Just like that. Gone. Outside the courthouse, Laura shook her head. You know, most attorneys wait their entire careers to watch a lawsuit self-destruct that efficiently. I couldn't disagree. After that, things changed. The luxury lodge project eventually scaled back. Whether investors got nervous, whether legal costs piled up, whether somebody finally recognized reality, I honestly don't know. Why to know is this? My cabin is still standing. Every morning the sun rises over the same mountains. The same trees sway in the wind. The same porch creaks under my boots when I walk outside with coffee in hand. And every now and then, I think about how close someone came to believing they could literally reposition another person's life because it interfered with a better view. Maybe that's the real lesson here. Ambition isn't the problem. Building something great isn't the problem. The problem starts when people convince themselves their goals matter more than everyone else's rights. Because eventually they stop seeing homes as homes, people as people, boundaries as boundaries. Everything becomes an obstacle. And when reality finally pushes back, they call it unfair. So now I want to ask you something. If you were in my position, what would you have done? Would you have tried negotiating first? Would you have gone straight to court? And after everything Travis did, do you think he deserved every consequence that followed? Or do you think tearing down the entire setup went too far? Let me know down in the comments. Because every time I tell this story, people end up arguing about that part more than anything else. And honestly, I can see why.